Hello students, in this video we'll see the analysis of task 3, devices of elaboration and condensation. The first rubric asks you to enclose independent and dependent clauses and decide if the sentences were simple, compound or complex. Besides, you had to analyze if the clauses were coordinated or if they had subordination. Finally, you needed to apply punctuation whenever possible. Some of you forgot to analyze punctuation, and let me tell you that punctuation is very important when joining clauses. Not only do we use punctuation when joining clauses, we also use punctuation in our writings. First, let's analyze simple sentences. Remember that a simple sentence is composed by only one independent clause and it contains only one verb. We have examples of simple sentences in exercises 3 and 11. Please note that in exercise 3, the verb is the verb be conjugated in present tense, and in exercise 11, the verb is still is, but it's combined with the existential there. Some of you have marked this last phrase as a clause. For my ears cannot be a phrase because there's no verb within it. In order to have a clause, we need to have a verb either finite or non-finite. This means conjugated or not. Remember also that the word for can be used as a coordinating conjunction, but it can also be used as a preposition. In this case, we are using the word for as a preposition before a noun phrase. For will be used as coordinating conjunction only when coordinating two independent clauses. In addition, note that in these two clauses, we haven't used any other punctuation but the full stops at the end of each clause. This happens because we are analyzing single independent clauses. Now we're going to analyze those compound sentences. Remember, a compound sentence is a combination of two independent clauses which are joined by the use of coordinating conjunction. Remember that every time we refer to coordinating conjunction, we refer to the well-known fanboys. Examples of compound sentences in this task are exercises 1, 5, 9, and 12. In all these exercises, we can see independent clauses which are joined by the use of a coordinating conjunction, majorly the word and, but also in exercise number 9, the use of the coordinator for. In this case, unlike the previous one, we can see how the word for is used to join two independent clauses. As regards punctuation, please note that before all the coordinators, we have the use of a comma. This happens because every time we use coordinating conjunction to join independent clauses, a comma is required. There's one more thing you have to take into consideration, and that is bracketing or enclosing. When enclosing compound sentences, the coordinators are never part of any of the independent clauses which are joined or involved in the compound sentence. Exercise 10 can be analyzed in two ways. In the first case, we can analyze exercise 10 as a simple sentence. We can analyze this exercise as a simple sentence because we can take it as a combination or a listing of items by the use of and with no subject involved in any of the clauses. However, there's a variant for this clause, and it's to analyze each of the directives separately. Each directive must be enclosed separately one from the other, and we need to leave the coordinator aside the independent clauses. In this case, it's not necessary to apply punctuation. In order to place a comma, both clauses must have their own subjects, and in this case, these two imperative clauses share an implied subject, which is the second person singular you. Let's continue with complex sentences. Remember, complex sentences are combinations of at least one independent clause and one dependent clause Examples of complex sentences in this task are exercises 2, 4, 6, and 7. In these exercises, the dependent clauses are introduced by a subordinator. Please note that dependent clauses are enclosed from the subordinator onwards. This means subordinators are part and they introduce dependent clauses. In exercises 2, 4, and 6, the dependent clause is used to introduce the sentence. In those cases, we will apply a comma after the dependent clause. But if the dependent clause follows the independent clause within the sentence, then no comma is required, as in exercise 7. Finally, in this task, we have an example of a compound complex sentence in exercise 8. Compound complex sentences have at least one dependent clause and more than one independent clause. In the first part of the sentence, we can find an independent clause with an embedded clause. This embedded clause is a dependent clause. We know it is a dependent clause because it begins with a subordinator. Besides, this dependent clause cannot stand alone as a complete idea. In this case, this dependent clause serves as an adverbial to give information related to the reason why this person hates coffee. Apart, we can see that this first independent clause is joined to another independent clause by the use of a coordinating conjunction and. As these two clauses can stand alone as complete meanings and they are independent clauses joined by coordinating conjunction, we need to apply a comma. Now let's move to the second rubric. In this second rubric, you had to analyze cases of ellipsis and structural condensation. In cases of ellipsis, you had to analyze if you could find textual or situational ellipsis. For ellipsis, you had to mark which was the omitted structure and the position in which occurred. In cases of structural condensation, you had to mark the word used to condense information or reduce the length of a piece of previous information and the position too. Please note that ellipsis and structural condensation are devices of reduction. So, whenever you have to analyze a case for ellipsis or structural condensation, you don't need to add anything to the clause. The only thing you have to do is analyze what happened to that clause. If there was something eliminated from the clause to avoid repetition, or if a structure has been changed for another new structure in order to condense some information. Let's begin with the cases of ellipsis. The first we're going to analyze is situational ellipsis. We have an example of situational ellipsis in exercise 4 and it's the only one we have. Remember that in cases of situational ellipsis, we don't have enough information within the clause or surrounding the clause, so we need to recreate a linguistic context in order to grasp which was the omitted structure. In exercise number 4, we can see there's situational ellipsis at the beginning of this clause. The missing element in this clause is the subject pronoun it. As it occurs at the beginning of the clause, we can say it happens in initial position. In this case, we can see there's not enough information surrounding this clause, so we need to recreate a kind of situation in which this could have happened. Maybe the speakers involved in this conversation are talking about a type of container. In textual ellipsis, the missing information can be recoverable from the surrounding text or piece of conversation. First, we'll analyze exercise 2. In exercise 2, we have a sentence which is made up by two clauses, a dependent clause and an independent clause. In this example, we can see textual ellipsis happens at the end of the first clause, which is a dependent clause. So there's no other option but final position for this textual ellipsis. In exercise number 3, we have a double case of textual ellipsis. In order to analyze this answer, which is really short, first you need to bear in mind the information covered on the previous question. Please note this question inquires about who is the easiest opponent for Mary. This means Mary is a better player than somebody else. The answer in this case is just giving us the name of the person who Mary can beat most easily. In this case, Phillips. So the information omitted in the answer can be found in the nearby text, which is the question. The first case of ellipsis happens at the beginning of the answer, and the structure which is missing is Mary can beat. Mary can beat who? Phillips. We can say it is placed in initial position because this structure must be placed at the beginning of the clause before Phillips, which is the object of the clause. The second item eliminated or omitted in this clause is most easily, which appears to be an adverbial for this clause. We can say it happens in final position because it's the last element of the clause after the object. In exercise number 3, we have a case of textual ellipsis also at the end of the first clause. Please note in this case we have two clauses. Both of them are independent clauses. And the omitted element in this case is the word letter. Likewise, in exercise number 9, we have another case of textual ellipsis happening in middle position in the dependent clause of this exercise. Please note that in this case, the missing element is part of the verb phrase. We must say that the missing element in this case happens in middle position because it is placed after the auxiliary verb but before the last element within the clause. We can find the last case of textual ellipsis in exercise 10. Here, the missing element occurs in final position after the last word of the clause, which is the word own. Own, in this case, is acting as a possessive adjective. Remember that possessive adjectives always need a noun phrase after them to be complete in meaning. We can also say that the missing element can be recoverable from the nearby text because we have previous information related to Sarah's drawings. Now we'll analyze the cases for structural condensation. Remember that structural condensation happens when we need to reduce the length of some information we have just said in previous clauses, and consider that the previous structure is replaced by a whole new structure. In this task, we can find examples of structural condensation in exercises 1, 5, 6, and 8. In exercise number 1, we have a case of structural condensation in which a possessive pronoun was used in order to condense some information and not to repeat a word that was used previously. Please note that in this clause, the speaker is establishing a comparison and is talking about somebody else's house. So in this case, the word theirs, which is a possessive pronoun, is replacing the whole structure their house, which is a combination of a possessive adjective and a noun phrase. We can say this structural condensation happens in final position because the word theirs is occupying the place of the last element within the clause. In exercise 5, we can find a whole new word used to condense information from the previous clause. Imagine that if we don't use the word does, in this case, we would say she understands the problem better than he understands the problem. And this is redundant. So in order to avoid this repetition and to avoid redundancy, we have used a proform, which is the word does. Finally, we can say this condensation occurs in final position because the word does is the last element of the clause. In exercise 6, we can see two clauses, an independent clause and a dependent clause following it. In the second clause, which is the dependent clause, we can see a personal pronoun condensing the noun phrase the poor girl. In this case, the condensed structure happens in middle position. Why? because although is the first element in this dependent clause, remember that subordinators are part and they introduce or head dependent clauses. And finally, let's analyze exercise 8. In exercise 8, we have a new structure condensing information from the previous clause. In this case, the word none replaces the idea of no building or any building. The second clause has a negative connotation, so in the second clause we need to use any building or no building. Additionally, check that in this case we are using singular form instead of plural form, which is the one we used in the previous clause. This happens because the second clause has a singular verb, so we need to apply a singular subject too. Lastly, we can say that in this case, condensation occurs in initial position. Remember that coordinators are not part of independent clauses, and we are using the word but to join two independent clauses, in which case none occurs as the subject of the second independent clause. That is why we say condensation occurs in initial position. Okay, students, this is the end of Task 3 analysis. It'll be great if you can watch this video before our lesson this Tuesday. Consider your mistakes, read your feedbacks, and any further doubt, we'll chat in our future video call.